Thinking time, come on, grab your friends. Let's go to my bedroom and record a podcast. Me, the host, and you, whatever your name is. The thinking never ends. It's thinking time with Tanner. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very first ever episode of Thinking Time with Tanner. I'm Tanner, and today we're going to be thinking about existential anxiety and how to live an authentic life. Most of the information from this episode came from a paper published by Bauman and Waldo in 1998 called Existential Theory and Mental Health Counseling. If it were a snake, it would have bitten. I'm not really sure what that title means, but it's a pretty sweet title for a paper, and it's got a lot of good information in it. So existentialism is this really big and complex topic with a bunch of German words, but we're going to try to keep things really simple and by focusing on a few main ideas. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to think more deeply about whatever existential anxiety or crisis you might be going through. The first thing we need to discuss when talking about existential anxiety or authenticity are the four givens of the human condition. Existential theorists have posited that there are four givens of the human condition that everyone is confronted with. And these four givens can be thought of as unavoidable, unconscious conflicts that shape our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. These givens are awareness of death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. So the first given is awareness of death. And basically what that means is that in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except for death and taxes. And that weird kid from class making his own podcast series. Although we know that death is a certain part of life, humans are terrified at the idea of non-existence, and we wish to continue living. The second given is freedom. This means that we create ourselves and we create our world. Ourselves and our world cannot be created for us, we must do it ourselves. Although it is comforting to believe that there's an objective structure and foundation outside of ourselves that can provide order to our world, ultimately we are the ones that have the freedom to do anything we want. The third given is existential isolation. And this basically means that the fundamental loneliness of the human condition is that we enter and leave the world alone, despite our desire to merge with others or be protected by them. Hammer argued that the longing for another is a desire to affirm one's own existence through the recognition of another, which sounds really cynical, but it also explains a lot about my ex. And he also said that love is only an illusion of preservation of the self. But later we're going to talk about how love is also considered to be the authentic or courageous response to loneliness. We'll discuss that later. The next given is meaninglessness, which is the awareness that there's no preordained direction or prescribed plan for one's life and no meaning inherent in the universe. So basically, life is objectively meaningless, and we have to create our own meaning in the world. The psychologist Viktor Frankl describes this desire to create meaning as the will to meaning, which he believed was the main motivation for human behavior. And an important point about his will to meaning is that it must be discovered by the individual. It cannot be given from outside sources. So we can't really give people their own meaning of life. They have to discover it for themselves. Another psychologist, Allport, believed that the central theme of existentialism is that we create purpose in dying and suffering. And he said, if there is a purpose in life at all, there must be a purpose in suffering and dying. Each must find out for himself and must accept responsibility that his answer prescribes. So again, kind of going along with Frankl's work, we have to create our own meaning, and we can find meaning even in suffering and dying. So the realization of these four givens, death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, can lead to existential anxiety, which is our response to the understanding that we have a responsibility to create a worthwhile existence in the limited time we have available. Now, existential anxiety is different from everyday anxiety. It's not accompanied by the usual somatic symptoms, but it's rather a deep feeling of unease that arises from our awareness of the givens. And although it sounds like a really bad thing, it sounds really scary, existential anxiety, especially from the existential psychotherapy perspective, should be viewed as a positive sign rather than a symptom of something going horribly wrong or as a symptom of some sort of pathology. Because experiencing this existential anxiety is a sign that you've begun accepting responsibility for creating a worthwhile existence for your life. So if you heard about existential anxiety and you're like, wow, that sounds like something I'm going through, don't worry about it too much. It's a normal part of life. It can be something that is very productive for you. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a really bad thing. On the other hand, existential guilt is different from existential anxiety. So existential guilt arises when you feel like you've not taken responsibility to create a worthwhile existence. Even this can be a good thing because you start to feel guilty. You're like, oh, I should be out there trying to create a worthwhile existence for myself. And then you have these feelings of guilt, which means you know that you should be doing something. And it's a signal that you're ready to start taking responsibility for your life. So now that we're aware of the givens of the human condition, and we are experiencing existential anxiety or guilt, how do we resolve these feelings and work towards building a meaningful existence? And the answer to that is through authenticity and authentic responses. So authenticity can be described as the kind of existence human beings have when they accept the responsibility for choosing the direction of their lives, and they base those choices on values determined through increasing self-awareness. So James Bugentel in 1965 described authenticity as a continuum that people can move along. And it's not really an absolute state of being. It's not necessarily that you reach authenticity and you just stay there, but it's sort of this continuum so you can be more or less authentic. And he went on to describe the 3 essential features of authenticity. So those three features are: 1, being highly aware of yourself and your world; 2, making choices with the understanding that decisions are unavoidable consequences of responsibility; 3, taking responsibility for the choices that are made and recognizing that our decisions might be imperfect, that choosing an alternative means rejecting other options, and that a tragic outcome is always a possibility. So really, to summarize what he thought were the 3 essential features of authenticity, we need to be aware of ourselves and our world, understand that we have freedom and exercise that freedom by making choices, and then sticking with those choices we made, understanding that we may not have made the best choice because we are imperfect beings and we make mistakes sometimes, but we ultimately then accept responsibility and the consequences of those decisions and choices that we make. And while authenticity sounds great and it's something we should strive for, Bugenzel also talked a little bit about the terrible nature of authenticity, which is that we must always make decisions without the guarantee of an outcome. And this responsibility to make the best decisions possible in order to create a worthwhile existence leads to existential anxiety. And he talked about existential anxiety as it has the potential to block people from becoming their best actualized self. And although people want to be the best they can, and we tend towards actualization, they soon get confronted with the high cost of authenticity, which is this existential anxiety that creeps up. And it's really difficult to be confronted with these givens and this existential anxiety, and we have to respond to it in some way. But it's really uncomfortable, and people don't like to be uncomfortable. So oftentimes they try to avoid it or circumvent this existential anxiety, which just doesn't help. So once we're confronted with existential anxiety, we have to choose between courageous responses and dreadful responses. The courageous response is to accept and incorporate existential anxiety into our lives. We use the 3 features of authenticity to first be aware of our choices, second, to make the best choices that we can, and third, to stick with the choice and acknowledge the fact that it may not have been the perfect one. The response of dread, on the other hand, is to retreat into inauthenticity and essentially to just not make a choice because we're paralyzed by fear and we don't want to make the wrong choice. Bugental believed that there are authentic responses or courageous responses to each of the four givens of the human condition. So the authentic response to death is faith. And he didn't mean faith necessarily in the religious sense of faith, but more so of faith in one's own existence. That we are here now, and even if everything else is uncertain, we have to be certain that we exist. So it's kind of similar to like Rene Descartes, and he's talking about the brain and the vat. He's like, if nothing else, I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I exist. We have to be certain that we exist. So the second authentic response is to freedom, and that response is commitment. So this one's pretty self-explanatory, but it means that we make decisions and we accept the consequences that come from those decisions, whatever they may be. These consequences can be good or bad, but the important thing is that we accept responsibility for our actions and we commit to the decisions that we make, and we see it through to the end. The authentic response to meaninglessness is creativity. And this creativity is not limited to the artistic sense of the word, but really it's the inner creativity of your ability to fulfill your own potential. A creative response is one that comes from within rather than being based on externally imposed values. It's basically our ability to solve problems on our own in a way that is meaningful and makes sense to us. And finally, the authentic response to isolation is love, and specifically the transcendent love of the I-thou relationship. So being in a relationship affirms our own existence in relation to another person. If we exist to another person, then it kind of lets us know like extra we exist. Like we don't have to just convince ourselves. We also have other people that believe we exist, and it's really comforting. And this definition of love is pretty similar to Hammer's definition we kind of discussed earlier. So responding authentically to existential anxiety really helps us create a worthwhile existence for ourselves, can help improve our mental health, and also not just our health, but our overall quality of life. So to recap, this has been a very, very brief overview of existentialism from the perspective of existential psychotherapy. We thought about the four givens of the human condition, which are death, freedom, meaninglessness, and isolation. We also thought about how existential anxiety as a response to realizing these givens and how we choose to respond, either with courage or with dread, determines our potential for achieving actualization and becoming our best selves. We also thought about how the essential components of an authentic or courageous response are being aware of ourselves and our world, making choices, and accepting the consequences of those choices. And finally, we thought about the authentic responses to the four givens, which are faith, commitment, creativity, and love. So hopefully this information has been helpful or at least interesting. If you want to learn more about existentialism, there's a ton of stuff out there. I'm sure you can find videos, papers. My hope is that you can take some of this information and apply it to your own life. Don't be afraid of existential anxiety. Do your best to confront it and respond with faith, commitment, creativity, and love. Thank you for taking the time to listen. This has been Thinking Time with Tanner. I'm Tanner, and I'll see you next time.